I've never really told this story before, but I owe this channel, sort of, to an episode of The Sopranos. Way back in the ancient year of, I think it was 2022, I came up with an idea based on one of my favorite episodes for a D&D subclass. I wanted to make a version of the Ranger class called the Happy Wayfarer, based on the Sopranos episode, The Happy Wanderer. In that episode, Tony describes a kind of person that he hates, the kind of guy who wanders through life with a clear head, whistling the happy wanderer. I thought that'd be a good idea, a very evocative idea for a character in D&D, so I made a class to go with it. I needed somewhere to publish that class, so I did so on DM's Guild, and to promote it, I made a Twitter account called Quinn the GM. Today, that is now the channel that you are currently listening to and watching, so I'm very happy for that. But The Happy Wanderer has always stood out to me as one of my favorite episodes in The Sopranos, and one that I think is both underrated and crucially important to Tony's psychology as a whole throughout the entire series, and what it'll eventually morph into by the very end. The Sopranos is the best show ever made. It's not my favorite show of all time, that's Better Call Saul, but I think if I'd seen The Sopranos first, I might like it more. This episode comes fairly early on in the second season, and it is an era of the show that I quite like. Season 1 of The Sopranos is really kind of strange to the point that I could make an entire video on that as well, as it is a very good season of television, but it is very slow, and everyone I've talked to who has started The Sopranos usually takes a very long time to finish the first season, and then everything after that just goes super quickly. So season 2 has started up at this point, and we are getting into the swing of things, and this comes along as kind of a continuation of Tony's transition into boss, as, but for all intents and purposes, the main driving action of this episode is Tony inheriting the executive game, this very high-stakes gambling game featuring characters such as Frank Sinatra Jr. So very high rollers, and Tony is taking it over from Jr., as Jr. is now incarcerated, and Tony is now officially the boss. But as is the case with Sopranos episodes, it's much more internally focused on the characters rather than this event in and of itself. I have to ask, what's your pick for the most underrated episode of The Sopranos? I feel like a new one stands out to me every time I rewatch. I'm currently on season 2, and From Where to Eternity just really was great when I rewatched it again, so that's another underrated pick from me. But honestly, I think I could write an essay about most episodes in season 6. Let me know in the comments below what's your favorite underrated Sopranos episode, and if you're down there, leave a like, subscribe, that typical YouTube stuff. I'd appreciate it. That character focus deals a lot with Davey Scatino, a character we meet for the first time in this episode. He went to high school with Artie and Tony, and I do really like the way he's introduced. Specifically, being introduced in a high school is a good way to kind of reinforce this connection, how these characters met, and additionally, it very organically introduces the fact that both his son and Meadow are classmates. They go to the same school. The son's name escapes me, even though I just watched this episode, but that's neither here nor there. There's no time for any of that. We're not doing a Game of Thrones video. Never mind. But anyway, Davey kind of goes on to embody this image that Tony thinks of in his head when he thinks the happy wanderer. This person that Tony resents because he is happy. He is just kind of having a good life. He's an average businessman. He owns a sporting goods store, but he does have a vice. He's a gambler, and through that, he's introduced to Tony's world. He continues gambling first with Richie, and then he makes his way into the executive game, and he just keeps losing. He's kind of an inversion of this idea of a happy wanderer as Tony is seeing it, as, well, he does appear to be happy and good on the outside. It's just this habit of his that continues to stop him from fulfilling that kind of vision of what Tony sees in him. Of course, Tony isn't completely blameless here. He is enabling Davey at the very least in terms of dealing with his addiction. We see Tony throughout the entire series have a very kind of blasé attitude towards addiction in general, be it substance abuse or gambling addiction. And I think he loves to use these things as a way to prey on people and sort of exploit weaknesses in them, as he is like to do. As Tony describes, he hates that happy wanderer. He wants to kick the shit out of him at any time. And I think he knows, or at least a part of him knows, subconsciously, that by allowing Davey to gamble at the executive game, Davey will lose and will become as miserable as Tony. It's kind of what Tony does, continually draw people into his web and into his world. We see him attempt to do it with Artie in the first season. We see him actually do it with Artie in the later seasons when Artie asks for money for that wine project. Qu'est-ce que c'est? Fax machine, or answering machine broken? I always think it's fax machine. And we also see that with other characters like Carmela's cousin in the third and fourth seasons, who's this tax man who ends up hanging out with a bunch of mob guys as that season progresses. Tony just wants to bring people down to his level at this point. What really stands out to me is how well defined this very negative aspect of Tony's character is this early on. By the end of season 6, it is completely clear that Tony is thoroughly a monster. He is the villain in this story, and he is making everyone's lives miserable no matter what. It's just kind of what he does by that point. Whether that's his fault or it's how he was raised, that's up for debate, but that is what he does. With that said, even this early on, we can see those elements of Tony's character beginning to poke through, which is fascinating because so many other shows kind of shy away from showing their protagonist in such a dark and unflattering light. And I think that getting to do that with The Sopranos and then to have him kind of consoling Davey after him losing so much and demanding his money, only to turn around and celebrate all of the winnings with Silvio, Polly, and Chrissy. It's just such a great, just kind of dual role to this character. So we see Tony the man and the monster in one. I think it's something that a lot of shows just really don't like to do, and I'm glad Sopranos did because it was very formative to what television has become. It's sort of a college situation, but continuing in that college, the episode, I believe it's episode 5 of The Sopranos, is the first time a television character who is the main character of a show and a good guy, supposedly, kills another character on screen. It was very big at the time. I also really like another element of this episode, that being Tony's hypocrisy regarding the title of the episode and what he expounds to Melfi in their scene together. He hates the Happy Wanderer, but what is Tony's main source of hatred in this episode? What makes him the most upset? It's not the Happy Wanderer. It's the opposite. Tony is at his most agitated in this episode, not when dealing with Davy or even dealing with Richie, but rather when forced to endure the presence of his mother, even when they aren't speaking and are a room apart. We see at Barb's father in law's funeral, Livia is there and acting as sort of a specter in Tony's field of vision, as she later goes on to literally do in his nightmares. The same thing happens in his daughter's recital, where Livia is just sitting behind him and acting as this malevolent force. In both instances, his negative energy is channeled towards this individual rather than any happy wanderer. Livia is kind of the opposite of a happy wanderer. I think it reflects both of these characters very well, as both Livia and Tony, as similar as they are beings of almost pure hate, I feel like. And I think that both of those individuals are able to express that towards those around them, oftentimes for being happy, but more often than not, they are angry with themselves and each other and those like them. While we're on the topic of things I like, the conversation between Junior and Tony is probably my third favorite between those two characters in the entire series. It's really informative to Tony as a character, and it really progresses his relationship with mental health and therapy in general. The previous episode, we had heard that Johnny Boy Soprano had the same panic attack episodes that his son did, and now we learn about a secret brother that Junior and Johnny had, that being Ercole Soprano, who was named after their grandfather and was sent away to live in a mental institution as he was slow, as is described by Junior. These revelations about his uncle and his father really progress how Tony feels about therapy and whether or not it is okay for him to undergo treatment, as there is really a rift between him and this idea after Melfi sends him away after having to go on the lam at the end of season 1, and he's really beginning to kind of reacclimate and get back into things. And it's these two revelations that kind of begin to get him on the track of, oh, this is an issue my family's been having. My family has some history of mental health struggles. It might be okay if I receive treatment. But it is a fascinating dichotomy as well, as Tony is okay with the idea of his father having these panic attacks as well, and he has sympathy for his uncle Ercole and his condition and what his death would have been. But he really doesn't spare any thought to Livia. She is continually brought up. Her issues are continually brought up by Melfi, and she is just continually disregarded. She was definitely the more abusive presence to Tony in childhood and even into adulthood, and she did try to have him killed, but there is a lack of understanding there where Tony is really willing to be understanding for all of the other role models in his life, even Junior, who also tried to have him killed. I think a lot of what this episode means to me is mostly as a cautionary tale. I can sort of relate to what Tony is saying in that therapy session, not wanting to beat Melfi's face into hamburger or really beat people in general, but there is that general sense of annoyance if you just walk down the street and see someone who seems happier than you are. It's a very human thing, a human reaction to just get that little itch of resentment in the back of your head. We don't all have explosive outbursts to that itch, as Tony does, but it is something that I think exists exists within many people, especially ones that struggle with mental health, as I have at certain points in my life as well. I think that Tony, as our very relatable protagonist, is sort of intended to serve as a version of what not to do. I think that a lot of The Sopranos is like that, in that it can be very much cloaked in satire and things like that in order to just send a message. But I think oftentimes that can be taken at face value. And I do think while the happy wanderer is very much a thing, there are people who are just generally happier than others. We should just generally be understanding of all people, as Tony kind of takes the opposite track and just kind of hates indiscriminately, as this episode seems to display. Two more little quick tiny notes. One, I really like how it deepens side characters' characterization as we get a little more on Silvio and Polly as this episode progresses, with Silvio's love of cheese apparently while gambling. And also, this episode is the first of two times an old man falls off a roof in The Sopranos, as Barb's father-in-law dies from that, and then later Carm's dad survives it, which is, I don't know, weird that it happens twice, I guess. Anyway, $4 a pound. Thank you all so much for watching. I normally talk about A Song of Ice and Fire, the books that Game of Thrones is based on, but The Sopranos is, as I mentioned, one of my favorite shows, and I thought it'd be fun to discuss an episode that has been very influential to me in both my YouTube career and just generally in terms of thinking about the world. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. I'd really appreciate it. It really helps grow the channel. And yeah, thank you so much for watching. I'll be back with more in the near future. Goodbye, everyone.